The Galactic Council laughed at humanity until the lights went out. Part 1: The Joke at the Table. The translator in my ear had a half-second delay. That half-second was just long enough for me to watch 60 alien faces react to something before I understood what had been said. And when the words finally arrived, when the polished, neutral voice of the translator delivered them cleanly into my ear, I had already seen the laughter. I had already felt it. The human observer will note that her species' application for full membership lists, among its primary contributions to galactic civilization, music, oral storytelling, and what is described here as an unusual capacity for psychological resilience. The chamber was enormous. It curved upward in a wide dome, and every seat was occupied by a delegate from one of the 61 species holding full council membership. The seat beside mine was empty. There was no second human delegate. There had never been one. I was the first human ever permitted inside this room, and I had been permitted only as an observer, not a voter, not a voice, not anything that mattered in a legal sense. I was there to watch, to learn, to represent 8 billion people who were waiting back home to hear whether, after 40 years of applying, humanity would finally be given a real seat at this table. The Vraxi delegate was the one who had read the list. His name was Velsitha, and he was tall, taller than any human, with 6 limbs and a crystalline structure along his back that caught the chamber light and scattered it into small, cold rainbows. His civilization had existed before Earth's first multicellular organisms had learned to divide. He was old in a way that I could not fully comprehend, and he spoke with the absolute ease of someone who has never once been doubted. I did not look at him when the laughter came. I looked at my pad instead, at the list he had just read, and I considered it carefully. Music, storytelling, psychological resilience. These were real things. These were things that had cost us enormously to develop and preserve. I was not embarrassed by them, but I understood, clearly and without any illusion, that Velsitha had read them the way a person reads a child's drawing aloud to make a room smile. The Shen delegate spoke next. The Shen were quieter than the Vraxi, smaller, smoother, with wide dark eyes that always looked slightly sad. Their civilization was younger than the Vraxis but still older than recorded human history. The delegate's name was Orulai, and she spoke gently, the way people speak when they want to be kind but cannot quite manage honesty at the same time. It is also noted, she said, that portions of the human home world still rely on combustion-based energy systems. This council celebrates all stages of development, of course, but membership requires a demonstrated capacity for civilization-wide technological coherence. More laughter, not loud, polite, the kind of laughter that is somehow worse than the loud kind because it does not feel the need to hide itself. I wrote one sentence on my pad. I wrote it slowly, and I did not look up while I wrote it. The sentence was, "Find the thing they have not looked at." My grandfather had told me something once, when I was 8 years old and had lost a school competition to a boy who had practiced twice as long as I had and whose parents had paid for better equipment. I had been furious in the way that only children can be furious, completely, physically, tearfully furious. My grandfather had sat with me on the back step of our house in Accra, and he had waited until I was quiet, and then he had said, "Yara, the people who laugh at you have already decided you are not a threat. That is the only gift they will ever give you. Do not waste it." I had not wasted it then. I was not going to waste it now. The session continued for another 3 hours. I listened to every word. I voted on nothing, because observers do not vote. I asked no questions, because I had learned in my first 2 weeks at Kepler Station that the questions an observer asks are noted, discussed, and used as evidence of one thing or another depending on who is doing the nodding. I smiled when it seemed natural to smile. I thanked Orulai afterward when she passed my seat, and gave me a small, careful nod that I interpreted as sympathy. Then the session ended, and the delegates filed out through their respective exits, and I stayed in my seat for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Chamber was beautiful. I will say that honestly. The Vraxi had designed it 400 years ago, and they had an extraordinary sense of scale and light. The dome above me was inlaid with a material that shifted color slowly, deep blue when the room was full, and now, as it emptied, moving toward a quieter green. The seats were arranged in perfect concentric rings, and every surface was clean in the way that very old, very well-maintained things are clean, not sterile, but worn smooth and cared for. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I picked up my pad and left through the observer's exit, which was smaller than the others and opened onto a corridor that led down into the station's lower levels. I had started walking the lower levels 3 weeks ago, not because anyone had told me to, and not because I had any particular plan. I walked them because I was an engineer before I was a diplomat, and engineers, when placed inside very large structures, tend to want to understand those structures. It is not a choice exactly. It is more like breathing. Kepler Station was old. It had been built by the Shen in what corresponded to Earth year 2061, and it had been expanded and modified by various member species in the centuries since. It orbited a trinary star system, 3 stars, bound in a slow gravitational argument with each other, and it was, by any measure, one of the most impressive things humanity had ever been close to. It was also, I was beginning to realize, not entirely well. I walked the corridor that ran beneath the main assembly ring, past the thermal exchange units and the atmospheric processors, and I stopped at the junction I had been thinking about since my 4th walk down here. Junction Corridor 7 Delta. It was not labeled importantly. It did not look like anything special. It was a wide intersection of relay conduits, thick cables and shielded channels that carried power and data between the station's primary grid and its distribution network. I had been studying the station's infrastructure schematics in the evenings, in my quarters, on a device that Velsitha had once held up during a technology review session and called charmingly primitive. The schematics were publicly available, part of the Council's open engineering record, and no one had flagged them as sensitive because no one, apparently, had looked at them carefully in a very long time. I looked at them carefully. I looked at them the way my grandfather had taught me to look at problems, from the outside, then from the inside, then from underneath. And standing in Junction Corridor 7 Delta, looking at the relay architecture that had been routing power through this station for 300 years, I felt the particular cold feeling that comes when you find the thing no one else found. Not excitement, exactly. Something quieter than that. Something that felt almost like responsibility. The station's primary power grid ran on a single interlocked relay system. It was elegant. It was ancient. It had been designed by engineers who were brilliant beyond any reasonable description, and it had worked without meaningful failure for centuries. It had also never been fully audited, not once, not in 300 years. I stood in that corridor for a long time. I looked at the schematic on my pad. I looked at the conduits around me. I thought about the laughter in the chamber above, and about Velsitha's cold rainbows, and about Orulai's careful, sad eyes. Then I thought about my grandfather. I opened a new document on my pad and began to write. The work had a name now, even if I was the only one who knew it. I called it, privately, only to myself, the audit. It was not a plan for anything dramatic. I want to be clear about that. It was not a plan for revenge or leverage or any of the things that might come to mind when an expelled observer begins quietly mapping the infrastructure of the most powerful station in the galaxy. It was simply the thing that needed to be done. It was the crack in the cathedral wall that I had found, and I was an engineer, and engineers do not walk away from cracks. I would find it properly. I would document it completely, and then I would decide what to do with what I found. Outside the corridor's small viewport, the 3 stars of the trinary system turned in their slow, unresolvable argument. The station hummed around me. 61 civilizations slept and argued and laughed above my head. I started writing. Part 2. What humans do when they are underestimated. The thing about Kepler Station that no one tells you before you arrive is how quiet it is at the lower levels. Not silent, never silent. The station was always alive with its own sound, the deep, rhythmic pulse of the thermal exchangers, the soft movement of atmospheric circulation fans, the occasional metallic complaint of a conduit adjusting to temperature shift. These were not unpleasant sounds. They were the sounds of a working structure, and I had grown up in working structures. My mother had been a civil engineer in Accra, and I had spent my childhood on construction sites and inside half-finished buildings, learning to hear what a structure was telling you if you paid attention. Kepler Station in its lower levels told me a great deal. I had given myself a project with no deadline and no supervisor, which was the best kind of project I had ever had. Every morning I attended whatever council sessions required an observer's presence, fewer than you might imagine. Most of the real work happened in closed committee, which I was not permitted to enter. Every afternoon I wrote reports for the Earth Diplomatic Office that were read by 2 people and filed by 1. And every evening, for 3 hours, I went down to the lower levels with my pad and my portable sensor suite and my comfortable shoes, and I worked. The sensor suite was the device that Velsitha had called primitive. He was not wrong about its age, but he was wrong about its capability. It had been built by a team at the Ganymede Infrastructure Relay, and it could read power fluctuation, thermal variance, and signal degradation through 3 layers of shielding. It fit in a bag that I carried over one shoulder. It required no external power source. It was, in the vocabulary of the Council's technology classification system, a Tier 2 device, roughly equivalent to what the Shen had used 200 years ago. I loved it. I had named it Edgar, after a professor of mine who had been equally small and equally reliable. I worked systematically. I started at the outermost ring of the lower levels and moved inward, section by section, logging every relay node and junction box and power distribution panel I encountered. I cross-referenced each one against the archive schematics and noted any discrepancy. Most discrepancies were minor: a node relocated by a maintenance crew, a panel replaced with a slightly different model. These were normal, expected. The kind of small changes that accumulate in any large structure over a long period of time. But there were other discrepancies, larger ones that were not on any maintenance record I could find, because maintenance records for the station's primary grid had not been consistently kept for the past 80 years. I found this out by requesting the records from the station's administrative office, and the administrative officer, a young Shen assistant named Tetavri, who was extremely efficient and quietly mortified by the gaps in the filing system, told me, with considerable embarrassment, that the primary grid was considered a legacy system, and that legacy systems were managed under a different administrative protocol that had not been meaningfully updated since the grid's original installation. So no one is actively monitoring it, I said. There is a passive alert system, Tetavri said. If a critical failure occurs, the alert system will notify the engineering office. And if something is developing slowly, a degradation, a cumulative stress, the passive system would not catch that. Tetavri was quiet for a moment. That is correct. I thanked her and went back to work. The picture that assembled itself over the next 6 weeks was extraordinary. Not in a good way, extraordinary the way a diagnosis is extraordinary when the doctor has been expecting something minor, and the scan shows something else entirely. The Vraxi-designed relay architecture that formed the backbone of Kepler Station's power grid was a masterpiece. I say that without any reservation. The original engineers had understood load distribution in a way that still impressed me, and the fundamental design had held up for 3 centuries because it was, at its core, a very good design. But a very good design maintained poorly, become something else. The primary grid ran on what the original schematics called a threaded web configuration, a system of interconnected relay nodes, each one capable of rerouting power around a failed neighbor. In theory, this made the grid extremely resilient. In practice, it created a single critical dependency that the original engineers had apparently assumed would always be monitored and serviced. Junction Corridor 7 Delta. The junction was not simply an intersection of conduits. It was the anchor point for the entire web, the node through which all major rerouting pathways passed. If the primary grid experienced a cascade failure anywhere in the station, every backup pathway converged on 7 Delta before redistributing. It was the safety valve and the load balancer and the emergency hub all in one. It had also not been serviced in 112 years. I ran the numbers 4 times. Then I ran them a 5th time using a different modeling approach because I wanted to be absolutely certain before I allowed myself to fully understand what I was looking at. The results were consistent. The relay hardware at 7 Delta was operating at 63% of rated capacity, degrading at a measurable rate, and handling a load that had increased by approximately 30% since the original installation, as the station had grown and added new sections. The gap between current capacity and required load was not large, but it was there, and it was getting larger, one slow percentage point at a time, every year. I calculated the projected failure window. It was not imminent, not days or weeks, but it was not distant either. And when it came, it would not be gradual. The threaded web architecture, because of how its rerouting logic worked, would attempt to compensate for any failure at 7 Delta by increasing load on the same failing hardware. The failure would accelerate itself. From initial fault to total grid failure, approximately 12 minutes. I sat with this information for a full evening before I contacted Earth Command. The connection took 40 minutes to establish because of the distance, and then another hour because I had to wait for the duty officer to wake the right people. I used the time to organize my documentation, every sensor reading, every calculation, every cross-reference schematic, into a package that could be transmitted and reviewed independently. When the call finally connected, it was Dr. Imani Voss on the other end. She was the lead engineer at the Ganymede Relay Facility, and she was one of the smartest people I had ever met, and she was also, which I had always appreciated, completely incapable of pretending to be calm when she was not. She was not calm. "Yara," she said, after I had walked her through the summary, "you are telling me that the seat of galactic governance runs on an unmonitored legacy grid with a single-point failure architecture that nobody has looked at in over a century." "I am telling you that, yes. And this junction, 7 Delta, if it fails, the whole station goes dark. The whole station. Communications, transit control, environmental secondary systems, everything except the emergency life support cells, which are isolated." There was a silence from Ganymede. "Imani," I said. "I'm here, I'm thinking. Take your time. Does anyone else know about this?" "No, I filed a preliminary infrastructure observation with the station's administrative office 3 weeks ago. It was acknowledged and logged. I have not heard anything since." Another silence, longer. "Yara, do you understand what you have here?" I thought about Velsitha's laughter. I thought about Orulai's careful sympathy. I thought about the expulsion vote that was scheduled for 28 days from now, and the way the council chamber had felt when I sat in the observer's seat and understood that the decision had already been made before I walked in. "Yes," I said, "I understand exactly what I have." "So what are you going to do with it?" I looked at my pad, at the diagrams and the numbers, at the patient, detailed record of 3 months of work that no one had asked me to do. "I'm going to document it completely," I said, "and then I'm going to present it to the council. As leverage. No, I said. As a report, as the thing it is. A safety hazard that needs to be fixed. There was a pause, and I could hear Imani breathing. And then she made the sound she always made when she was recalibrating her understanding of a situation. They're going to vote you out in 4 weeks, she said. I know. And you're going to hand them the solution anyway. I'm going to tell them about the problem, I said. Whether they want the solution is their choice. Imani was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I need to run some models on your data. Can you send me the full package? Already transmitted. Of course it is, she paused. Yara, for what it's worth, I think you're the best kind of crazy. I smiled. That's the nicest thing anyone has said to me in 4 months. Go sleep. I'll call you when I have the model results. I closed the connection and sat in my quarters on Kepler Station, listening to the hum of the structure around me. The same hum that had been running for 300 years. The same hum that had somewhere underneath it a quiet, patient fault, counting down. I was not afraid of what was coming. I had been afraid of bigger things and survived them. What I felt, sitting in that small room with the 3 stars of the trinary system visible through the viewport, was something closer to clarity. The work was real, the problem was real, and I was going to see it through, regardless of what happened in the chamber above. I had not come this far to be half of what I was capable of being. I opened my pad and kept working. Part 3, the vote. I had rehearsed my 5 minutes 41 times. Not the exact words. I have never been someone who reads from a prepared text, because the moment you read from a text you stop watching the room, and the room is always more important than the text. But I had rehearsed the structure, the order of ideas, the pace. I had rehearsed it in my quarters, in the lower corridors, in the small observation lounge on Deck 9, where the viewport faced away from the trinary stars and toward the open dark, and where I could stand and talk to the empty space and not feel self-conscious about it. 41 times, because the first 40 had each revealed something small that needed adjusting. The session opened at what Kepler Station's internal clock designated as morning, though morning meant nothing here in orbit around 3 suns that never set in any meaningful way. The chamber was full. I had expected it to be full. An expulsion motion brought observers from every member species, not just the primary delegates. The gallery above the main floor, normally occupied by staff and junior diplomats, was packed. I was in the observer's seat. I had dressed carefully. Not formally, in the way that alien delegates dressed formally. Those presentations involved materials and colors that carried specific meanings in their respective cultures, and wearing the wrong shade of something could accidentally imply a political position. I wore clean, simple clothes in a neutral color, and I wore my engineering badge from the Ganymede relay on the left side of my jacket, because it was the only thing I owned that felt like armor and looked like something else. Valsitha opened the proceedings. He moved through the formal language of the motion with practiced ease, his translator delivering each phrase in the flat, even tone that council translators used for procedural language. The charges were read: unauthorized commercial development in sectors 7 through 12 of the Galactic Fringe, in violation of Provisional Member Protocol 44C, which required council approval for any trade agreements affecting established member territories. The charges were real. I will not pretend otherwise. Humanity had been building trade relationships on the fringe for 6 years, small ones, at first, and then larger ones as those early connections proved profitable. The Earth Diplomatic Office had argued consistently that the fringe sectors were not clearly within the 44C definition of established member territory. The Council had disagreed consistently. The argument had been ongoing for 4 years, and now it had arrived here, at this motion, which had 51 votes lined up in favor before I had even walked into the room this morning. I knew the vote count. I had spent the last 2 weeks counting carefully. Velsitha finished the opening statement and turned to the floor. The process allowed the subject of an expulsion motion to address the council for 5 minutes before the vote. This was not a debate. It was not an appeal. It was, essentially, a formality, a civilized acknowledgement that the person being removed from the room had once had a voice there. I stood up. Dr. Yara Osai, the chair announced. Observer for the human species, 5 minutes. I walked to the speaking floor. It was a slightly raised circle of polished material in the center of the chamber, and when you stood on it, every seat in the room was arranged around you in a perfect arc. I had stood on it twice before, both times to provide technical information requested by a committee. This was different. I did not begin by addressing the charges. The delegates who wanted to vote against humanity had already made their decision, and I was not going to change it by arguing procedure at them for 5 minutes. I was also not going to beg, or make an emotional appeal, or do any of the things that might have felt satisfying and would have accomplished nothing. I began by saying something that made the room go very quiet. I would like to tell this council about a problem with your station. Velsitha's crystalline ridges shifted slightly. I had learned over 4 months that this was his version of a raised eyebrow. I spoke for 4 minutes and 40 seconds. I told them about the threaded web architecture. I explained the load distribution logic of the primary grid in terms that were accessible to any engineer in the room, and Kepler Station had many engineers. I described precisely and without any embellishment the condition of junction corridor 7 delta, the hardware degradation, the increasing load, the convergence of failure pathways. I showed them the projected failure window on the chamber's shared display screen. I showed them the numbers. I did not tell them I had spent 3 months on this work. I did not tell them it was the kind of work that I had done alone, in the evenings, in corridors that none of them had walked in years. I simply presented the findings, the way any engineer presents findings, clearly, completely, without decoration. I am not presenting this as a negotiation, I said, and I looked around the room as I said it, meeting eyes where eyes existed. I am presenting it because this is what my species does. We find the things that are broken. We document them. We tell the relevant people. We have been trying to do this in various ways, in various forms, for 40 years. This is one more attempt. Silence. Velsitha spoke. The human observer is describing an infrastructure concern in the middle of an expulsion proceeding. Yes. This is highly irregular. Yes. One might interpret this as an attempt to create leverage. I looked at him directly. One might, but one would be wrong. I paused. You are going to vote me out of this room in a few minutes. I know that. I knew it before I walked in this morning. I am telling you about this problem anyway because the problem is real and it needs to be fixed, and I am an engineer, and engineers do not walk away from problems simply because they are no longer being paid to solve them. Velsitha was still. I am not threatening to turn off your lights, I said. I am trying to make sure no one else does. There was a longer silence after that, not the comfortable silence of agreement, and not the uncomfortable silence of offense. It was the specific silence of a room that is thinking. Then the 5 minutes ended, and I returned to the observer seat, and the vote proceeded. It was not close. 53 votes were cast, 38 were in favor of expulsion, 15 were opposed. The motion carried. The chair announced the result in the flat procedural voice that council chairs use for announcements, and the delegates around the room made their various small movements of acknowledgement or satisfaction or discomfort, depending on who they were and what they felt. I nodded. I wrote one word on my pad. Then I gathered my things, stood up, and walked to the observer's exit, the small one, the one that opened onto the corridor that led down to the lower levels. I did not look back at the chamber. I had looked at it enough. I had memorized it in the way that you memorize a place you know you will not see again, in the same way: the shape of the dome, the color of the walls, the precise arrangement of 61 seats around a circle that had one fewer occupant now than it had had this morning. The door closed behind me. I was in the corridor. The corridor was the same as it had always been. The thermal exchangers ran their familiar rhythm somewhere below me. The station hummed. My pad buzzed. The message was from Dr. Imani Voss at the Ganymede Relay. It had been sent 4 hours ago, queued through the standard transmission delay. I had been expecting a follow-up on the infrastructure models, but what she had written was not a follow-up. It was 8 words, and the 8 words changed the shape of everything. The message read, "Yara, we built you a solution, call me." I stood in the corridor, reading those 8 words, and I thought about the teams at Ganymede who had looked at my data and done what human engineers always do when you give them an interesting problem. They had stayed up all night working on it. I called her. Part 4: The Dark. The call with Imani lasted 2 hours and 20 minutes. In that time, she walked me through everything the Ganymede team had built over the past 3 weeks, working from my sensor data and schematics, running on no specific mandate and no official budget, on their own time, because the problem was genuinely interesting and they were genuinely engineers. What they had designed was not simply a repair, it was a rebuild. The original threaded web architecture had one critical flaw: its resilience was entirely dependent on the health of a single anchor node. Fix the node and you fix the immediate problem, but the structural vulnerability remained. The Ganymede team had looked at this and decided correctly that fixing a flaw of that kind required a different approach. They had designed what Imani called a distributed relay matrix, a modified architecture in which the anchor function of 7 delta was spread across 17 separate nodes, each one capable of handling the full rerouting load independently. Not a repair, a replacement, a version of the threaded web that could lose any single node or any 4 nodes simultaneously and continue running without interruption. How long to install? I asked. 9 to 11 days with a full team. We'd need 6 engineers on site, access to the primary grid corridors, and about 400 kilograms of relay hardware that we can have at Kepler Station in 3 days if we send it on the fast cargo run. I looked out the viewport of the small lounge where I had taken the call. The trinary stars were visible in their slow rotation, 3 bodies in a gravitational conversation that had been ongoing for longer than life on Earth had existed. "Imani," I said, "we don't have access anymore. I was expelled 4 hours ago." "I know," she paused, "but the problem doesn't care that you were expelled." "No, it doesn't. The station is still going to fail. The timeline you calculated, what was the outer bound? 18 months. But that assumed stable conditions. Any spike in power demand, a major session, a systems test, unusual atmospheric load could accelerate it significantly. And the Council's engineering office, you said they acknowledged your preliminary report. They logged it. That's not the same as acting on it. No, it isn't. I thought about this for a moment. Then I made a decision that was not particularly complicated, because when you strip away everything except the actual situation, most decisions are not particularly complicated. "Send the hardware," I said, "and I'll reach out to the station." "You were expelled this morning, Yara." "I know, but the problem doesn't care about that either." She was quiet for a moment. "You are definitely the best kind of crazy." I filed the necessary shipping documentation from a cargo terminal on the station's commercial deck, using the last of my observer credentials before they were formally revoked at midnight. The hardware would arrive in 72 hours. Whether anyone would let me use it was a separate question. I booked a berth on a human cargo freighter that was departing in 6 hours, because an expelled observer living on a council station was technically in violation of residency protocol, and I did not want to give anyone a reason to make the situation more complicated than it needed to be. I packed my bag. It did not take long, because I had never unpacked fully, which was a habit from a career spent working in places I might need to leave quickly. I spent the last hours before departure in Junction Corridor 7 Delta. Not working, just standing, listening to the hum of the hardware around me, the patient sound of a system doing its job under conditions it had never been designed for. There was no distress in the sound. There never is with failing infrastructure. Things do not announce their own decline. They simply continue and continue and continue until the moment they stop. I left the station on schedule. The freighter was a mid-range cargo vessel called the Lodestar, crewed by a rotating team of 8 humans who moved through the narrow corridors with the practiced ease of people who had spent most of their adult lives in small spaces. The captain's name was Graham, a compact man in his late 50s who had been running cargo routes on the galactic fringe for 20 years, and who had the particular quality that long-haul pilots develop, which is an absolute refusal to be surprised by anything. He was not surprised to find a recently expelled diplomatic observer boarding his ship with a single bag and a portable sensor suite named Edgar. "Passenger manifest says you're going to the Ganymede relay," he said. "Eventually," I said, "I may have a stop on the way." He looked at me for a moment, then nodded once, the way experienced people nod when they have correctly assessed a situation and decided it is not their problem. I set up in the small work alcove behind the cargo bay and continued my calculations. The failure, when it came, did not come the way I had modeled it in my most conservative scenario. It came faster. I was 3 light hours from Kepler Station, 11 days after my departure, when Edgar picked up the automated distress frequency on the standard Council emergency channel. I had programmed Edgar to monitor that frequency. I had done it the day before I left the station, because I had known, with the particular knowledge that comes from looking at numbers carefully for a very long time, that the question was not whether it would happen. It was when. It had happened at 3:40 station time, during what the Council designated as the low-activity night period, the time when power demand was lowest and the maintenance cycles were quiet. A thermal stress fracture had developed in the primary relay housing at 7 Delta. The housing had been flagged in my audit as the highest risk component on the station, the one most likely to fail first, the one I had documented in the most detail in the report that had been logged and not acted on. The fracture triggered a load spike. The threaded web attempted to reroute. The rerouting concentrated additional load on the already degraded hardware at 7 Delta. The hardware degraded further. The web rerouted again. The process repeated, each cycle faster than the last, each cycle drawing more from the failing anchor node. From initial fault to total grid failure, 14 minutes. 2 minutes longer than my worst-case model, which meant the hardware had held slightly better than I had estimated. Then the lights went out. Not metaphorically, not as an expression. The primary grid of Kepler Station, the power architecture that ran everything except the isolated emergency life support cells, failed completely. Communications went dark. Transit control went dark. The shared display systems, the environmental secondary units, the data networks, every connected system on the station dark. 61 civilizations, represented by their senior diplomats, sat in the most important room in the galaxy with no lights and no way to call anyone. I was reading the distress signal on Edgar's screen when Graham appeared in the doorway of the work alcove. "Station's broadcasting on emergency channel," he said. "I know." He looked at me. "You knew this was going to happen." "I reported it to the Council 6 weeks ago." "And they did nothing." "They logged it." Graham was quiet for a moment. Then, "What do you want to do?" I looked at the screen. I thought about Orulai's careful eyes. I thought about Velsitha's laughter in the chamber, and the cold rainbows his crystalline back scattered across the walls. I thought about 61 species sitting in the dark in a room they had built to govern the galaxy, and the hardware shipment that was currently in transit and would arrive at the station in 61 hours if no one redirected it. I thought about my grandfather. Do not waste the gift. Turn around, I said. Graham turned around without another word. He was on the comm to his navigator before he had cleared the doorway. I opened the station's emergency frequency and keyed the transmit function on Edgar. The signal was weak at this distance. 3 light towers is a long way for a Tier 2 device to broadcast, but the emergency channel had amplification protocols built in, and I had calculated the relay routing before I left. The connection was slow. There was static and silence and more static, and then a voice came through, a young Shen voice, tight with a controlled version of what I recognized, even through translation as fear. This is Kepler Station Emergency Operations. Please identify. My name is Dr. Yara Osai, I said. I was the human observer to the Galactic Council until 11 days ago. I have a solution to your power grid failure. I have a full engineering team and the required hardware in transit. I am requesting permission to return to the station and begin repair operations. Silence on the channel. A longer silence than I had expected. I waited. I am good at waiting. It is one of the things my career has taught me that I did not expect to learn when I started. Dr. Osai, the voice said, you were expelled from the station. Yes. The expulsion is a matter of formal council record. I know. Another silence. I could hear, even through the static, the sound of the station's emergency systems, the hum of isolated life support, the absence of everything else. One moment, please, the voice said. I waited. I was 3 light towers from Kepler Station, on a cargo freighter that had just turned around, with a portable sensor suite named Edgar on the table in front of me, and a team of 6 engineers whose hardware shipment was 61 hours out. I waited. The static on the channel shifted, and then a different voice came through, older, slower, carrying the particular weight of someone who has just spent several hours in the dark thinking about things they should have thought about a long time ago. It was Velsitha. Dr. Osai, he said. Velsitha, I said. A pause. Your preliminary report, he said. The one filed 6 weeks ago. It was reviewed by our engineering office. They assessed the timeline as non-critical and scheduled a review for the next maintenance cycle. I know. That review was scheduled for 7 months from now. I know. Silence. Through the static, I heard something that I had never heard from Velsitha in 4 months of sitting across from him in council sessions. Something that did not translate well but that my mind categorized, automatically, as discomfort. You are calling to offer assistance, he said. Yes. Despite the expulsion. Despite the expulsion. Another pause, longer, and underneath it, barely audible through the signal degradation, the quiet sound of a station running on its last independent power reserves, patient, diminishing, waiting. We would be grateful, Velsitha said, for your assistance. I allowed myself privately 1 breath. I'll be there in 72 hours, I said. Tell your engineering office to clear access to the primary grid corridors, and someone should check on the atmospheric secondary units on Deck 6. The emergency cell covering that section has a lower reserve capacity than the others. I noted it in my audit. A pause. How did you? I read the schematics, I said. All of them. Sleep well, Velsitha. I closed the channel and sat back in my chair. Through the small viewport above the work alcove, the trinary stars were visible, 3 lights in the dark, still turning in their ancient, unresolved conversation. I watched them for a moment. Then I opened a message to Amani. The message said, "We're going back, have the team ready, bring coffee." She replied in 11 minutes, which, accounting for transmission delay, meant she had been sitting at her console waiting. Her reply said, "Already packed, tell me everything." I smiled. I started writing. Part 5, After the Lights Come Back On. We docked at Kepler Station's emergency bay at 600 station time, 71 hours after my call to Velsitha. The station was not fully dark when we arrived. The emergency life support cells were still running, and a small number of essential systems had been restored through a manual bypass that the station's own engineers had worked out in the first 24 hours. A good solution, competently executed, that bought them additional time. I noted this in my log and made a point of saying so to the engineering supervisor who met us at the docking ring. His name was Cho, a compact Shen with 3 decades of station maintenance experience, and he had the look that engineers get when they have been awake for too long working on a problem they do not fully understand. Sharp, tired, and deeply relieved to see someone who might understand it better. "Dr. Osai," he said, with the formal Shen greeting that involves pressing the first 2 fingers of the right hand briefly to the left wrist. "Your reputation precedes you." "I hope not all of it," I said. "This is Dr. Imani Voss, lead engineer. The team behind her is Wei, Barker, Odell, Fletcher, and Knight. They are the best relay engineers in the human system, and they have been awake for approximately 36 hours. So please have someone show them to the temporary quarters before we start." Joe blinked, of course. Imani handed him a hardware manifest. "The relay components are in the forward cargo section. We'll need a lift team and access to the primary grid corridors within the hour. Do you have the corridor schematics updated to include any modifications made since Dr. Osai's audit?" Cho looked at the manifest, then at Imani, then back at the manifest. "We do. I will have them transferred to your systems immediately." "Thank you," Imani turned to me. 7 hours of sleep, then we start." 6, I said. 7. You are no good to anyone operating on 6 hours, and this job requires you to be good. I conceded. I was too tired to argue, and she was not wrong. The crew quarters they gave us were small and located on Deck 8, which was closer to the lower levels than to the main assembly ring. I was grateful for this. I slept for 7 hours with the sound of the station's reduced hum in the walls, and when I woke up, I felt the particular clarity that comes after a long journey ends, and the work you have been building toward is finally in front of you. We began at 1400. The corridors of the lower levels were familiar to me in the way that places become familiar when you have walked them many times alone. But they were different now, with 7 people moving through them, with equipment cases being carried and tools being laid out, and Imani's voice running through the day's priorities in the brisk, organized manner that had made her the best engineer I had ever worked with. We started at Junction Corridor 7 Delta. The state of the hardware was worse in person than it had looked on the sensor readings. Not dramatically so. I had calibrated my models carefully. But there is always a gap between data and the physical object, and standing in front of the primary relay housing and seeing the thermal stress fracture with your own eyes is different from representing it as a number in a report. Barker, who was our relay specialist and had 20 years of experience, crouched in front of the housing for a long moment, studying it. "You ran this calculation right," she said. "Honestly, I'm surprised it held as long as it did." "The original engineers built it well," I said. "They did, and then nobody looked at it for 100 years. And then nobody looked at it for 100 years. We began the installation. I will not describe every hour of the 11 days that followed, because many of those hours were exactly what infrastructure work always is: methodical, quiet, repetitive, demanding a kind of attention that does not translate well into narrative. We pulled hardware and installed hardware. We ran tests and reran them. We recalibrated and adjusted and tested again. Wei was meticulous in a way that sometimes slowed us down and always produced correct results. Odell had a gift for identifying potential failure modes that no one else had thought to check. Fletcher and Knight worked as a pair with such established efficiency that they sometimes completed tasks before the task had been formally assigned. Imani ran the operation the way she ran everything, with a combination of precision and warmth that made people want to do good work. She remembered everyone's name. She checked in. She noticed when someone needed a break before they noticed it themselves, and she found ways to frame breaks as strategic decisions rather than admissions of fatigue, which is a skill I have always admired. I was on the floor for all of it. On the second day, Velsitha came to Junction Corridor 7 Delta. He did not announce himself. He simply appeared at the entrance to the corridor, standing very still in the way that his species tends to stand still, completely, with the particular quality of a large, complex thing that has decided not to move. I saw him first and said nothing. I continued what I was doing, which was recalibrating a relay node at approximately knee height. After a moment, Ameni noticed him too, and made a small gesture to the team that meant continue working. Velsitha watched for several minutes without speaking. Then he said, "You are using a distributed matrix configuration." I looked up from the node. Yes. The original design used a single anchor architecture. It did. The distributed matrix eliminates the single point dependency. Any 4 nodes can fail simultaneously without interrupting grid function. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "This was not in your preliminary report." "No, the preliminary report identified the problem. This is the solution. My team developed it after the report was filed. While you were still on the station." "While I was still on the station." Another silence. His crystalline ridges caught the work lights and scattered them across the corridor walls, the same small, cold rainbows I had watched in the council chamber on my first day. I had thought of them as cold then. I was not sure I thought of them that way now. "May I ask a question?" Velsitha said. "Of course." "The load tolerance modeling in your audit, the projection that identified the failure window, how long did that take you?" I set down the calibration tool. The initial modeling took about 3 weeks. I refined it over the following month as I gathered more sensor data. "You were doing this while attending council sessions?" "In the evenings, yes." "Alone?" "Yes." He looked at the corridor around him, at the team working, at the equipment cases, at the schematic display running on the wall panel that Wei had set up on the first day. "This station has 61 member species," Velsitha said. "We have engineers from every one of them. Many of those engineers have been stationed here for decades." He paused. "None of them found this." I thought about what to say, and then I said the true thing rather than the diplomatic thing, because we were past the point where the diplomatic thing was the useful thing. "They weren't looking," I said. "Not because they're bad engineers, because no one told them to look. Legacy systems don't get looked at. That's a management problem, not an engineering problem." Velsitha considered this. "And you looked?" "I look at everything. It's a habit." Another silence. The corridor hummed around us. On day 6 he came back. That is what Ameni wrote in her log, which she shared with me years later. She had been watching from the beginning, in the way that Ameni watches things carefully and without drawing attention to herself. On day 6, Velsitha returned to the corridor, and this time he had a question about load tolerancing, a specific technical question about how the distributed matrix handled asymmetric load distribution during a partial failure scenario. I answered the question. It took about 10 minutes. On day 7, he came back with 2 questions. On day 8, 3. On day 9, he arrived with a set of schematics, old ones, from the station's original construction archive, and asked whether the matrix configuration could be adapted for the secondary grid as well as the primary. That conversation lasted 2 hours, and by the end of it, we were both sitting on equipment cases in the corridor, and the rest of the team had arranged themselves nearby with the particular casual posture of people who are definitely not listening, but absolutely are. On day 10, Volsutha brought lunch. I do not know what it was called in Vrexy. It was contained in sealed vessels and it smelled unusual, and it was, after some consideration, actually quite good. "I owe you an acknowledgement," he said while we ate. "You don't," I said. "I do." He was direct about it, in the manner of someone who has thought about something carefully and decided that directness is the right approach. "I read the session transcript from your final address, the one I called irregular." "It was irregular." "It was also correct. You identified the problem. You presented it in a formal session. You did not ask for anything in return." He paused. "I characterized it as an attempt to create leverage." "You were not unreasonable to think that." "I was not entirely reasonable either." His crystalline ridges shifted. "In my experience, when someone presents a problem during a proceeding designed to their disadvantage, it is because they want something from that problem. This is a pattern I have observed over a very long time." "It's a reasonable pattern," I said. "Most of the time it's probably correct." "And this time it was not." "No." He was quiet for a moment. "Why not?" "I thought about my grandfather. I thought about the back step of the house in Accra, and the particular quality of the evening light there, and the way my grandfather had spoken, not with great drama, but with the simple authority of someone who had thought carefully about the world and arrived at conclusions he trusted. Because fixing the problem was the right thing to do," I said. "And my people have never been good at leaving right things undone just because the situation was inconvenient." Volsutha looked at me for a long moment. Then he said something in Vrexy that my translator rendered, with unusual hesitation, as, "A species that does right things in inconvenient situations is either very foolish or worth knowing. Possibly both." "Possibly both," I agreed. On day 11, we tested the completed matrix. The test was formal, witnessed by Cha and 3 other station engineers, logged in the Council's technical record, conducted under the parameters that the original design specifications had required for primary grid certification. Ameni ran the test sequence from a portable console, while the team monitored the node readings from positions throughout the primary grid corridors. The first sequence, normal operating load, all 17 nodes functioning within parameters. The second sequence, simulated cascade failure at the former location of the 7 delta anchor point. The matrix rerouted load across the remaining nodes in 4.3 seconds, no interruption to grid function. The third sequence, simultaneous failure of 4 nodes at random positions in the network. The matrix adapted, load redistribution complete in 7.1 seconds, grid function maintained. The fourth sequence, Ameni looked at me from across the corridor and raised one eyebrow. I nodded. She ran the fifth sequence that was not in the test protocol, the one we had designed ourselves, the one that modeled the worst-case version of the failure that had actually occurred. The full cascade, the full load, the exact conditions that had taken the station dark 11 days ago. The matrix processed it in 9 seconds, grid function maintained throughout, no failures, no interruptions. Cha made a sound that I could not identify in any cultural context, but that I instinctively understood as relief. Ameni closed the test console and turned to me. "Done," she said. "Done," I said. The council session was called for 3 weeks after the station's power was fully restored. I did not know it was going to happen until the formal notification arrived in my message queue, sent to the Ganymede relay, which had been my official address since my return from Kupla Station. The notification was from the Council Administrative Office, and it was brief and formal in the way that Council communications always were. It informed me that a motion had been placed before the full Council regarding the status of human representation, and that, as the designated human observer of record, I was requested to attend. I read it twice, then I forwarded it to Ameni, who called me within the hour. "They're reconsidering," she said. "I see that." "Yara, do you understand what this means?" "I understand what it might mean. I'm not going to assume until I'm in the room." "You're impossible. You've said that before." "I say it regularly because it remains true." A pause. "Are you going?" "Of course I'm going." I was back at Kupla Station on the morning of the session. The station was fully operational, the new matrix running quietly and cleanly beneath the corridors, distributing power through 17 independent pathways with a resilience that the original architecture had never had. The lights were on. Communications were running. The station smelled different than it had during the 11 days of repair work, cleaner, more alive. The recycled air carrying the dozens of ambient scents that 61 species on a working station produce without thinking about it. I was shown to a seat. Not the observer's seat. A seat at the main table. I looked at it for a moment before I sat down. It was the same material as the other seats, the same worn polish, the same precise placement in the concentric arc of the chamber. It was not larger or more ornate than any other seat. It was simply a seat at the table where the decisions were made. I sat down. The session opened with formalities, the kind of procedural language that council sessions begin with, which I had learned to listen to carefully because the tone of the formalities tells you a great deal about the mood of the room. The mood today was different from any council session I had attended before. Not exactly warm, not exactly comfortable, but attentive in a way that felt genuine rather than performed. Orulai spoke first. She stood and made the formal request, a motion to reconsider humanity's membership status, with an accompanying apology for the conduct of the previous proceeding. The apology was short. It did not elaborate, which I respected. Long apologies have a way of becoming more about the person apologizing than the person being apologized to. The motion was seconded immediately by 7 delegates. I was given 10 minutes to address the council. I used 3. I said thank you. I said that humanity had wanted to contribute to the council for 40 years, and that we were still ready to do that, and that the engineers sitting back at the Ganymede relay right now were already working on proposals for 2 other infrastructure improvements they had identified while reviewing the station's schematics during the repair project. I said that we had not come all this way to occupy a seat. We had come because we genuinely believed that the work of building and maintaining a galactic civilization was something we could help with. I sat down. The vote was called. I did not count to 57. I counted from the beginning, the way I always count, carefully, completely, every number in its right place. I knew what the number would be before the chair announced it, and when the chair announced it, I allowed myself the particular quiet feeling of a thing that has been true for a long time finally being acknowledged. 57 in favor, 4 opposed. I was a full member of the Galactic Council. The chamber did not erupt in celebration. That is not how the council works. Delegates made their acknowledgement gestures in their respective traditions, and the session continued to the next item of business, because governance is always ongoing and there is always a next item. Velsitha leaned toward me from the adjacent seat. I had not known he would be adjacent. He had arranged it deliberately. I realized a gesture in a language that did not require translation. "For the record, human," he said quietly, "I did not vote against you." "I know," I said, "I counted." He made a sound that, after 4 months of watching him carefully, I recognized as the Vraxi equivalent of a laugh, not the cold, public laughter of the first session, but something smaller and warmer, the kind that comes from genuine surprise. "You always count," he said. "It's a habit." He nodded once. Then he turned back to the session, and I turned back to the session, and the Galactic Council continued its work. I wrote a message to Amani that evening. It said, 57 to 4, tell the team. Then get some sleep, we have 2 infrastructure proposals to finish. She replied in 8 minutes, already started on the first one. Also crying a little, professional crying, work crying, it's fine. I smiled at the screen in my quarters, the same small room on Deck 8, which I had been told I could keep for as long as I needed it. The viewport faced the trinary stars. I had grown accustomed to watching them in the evenings, these 3 suns in their long, gravitational conversation, none of them able to fully resolve their relationship with the others, all of them nevertheless generating enough light and heat between them to make life possible on the worlds that orbited nearby. There is something in that, I think, if you want to look for it. They gave us a seat at the table because we were useful. I want to be honest about that. It was not charity, and it was not a change of heart born entirely from goodwill. We earned the seat by doing the work, by finding the thing that was broken, by fixing it without asking for anything in return, by being present and persistent and genuinely helpful in a situation where we had every reason to walk away. That is fine, that is a beginning. We have started with less. My grandfather told me once near the end of his life that the great mistake of powerful people is to believe that their power protects them. It does not protect them. It insulates them from the problems they have stopped paying attention to, which is not the same thing. The problems are still there. The cracks are still growing. The relay hardware is still degrading, one slow percentage point at a time. What protects you is the presence of someone who is still paying attention. We are good at paying attention. We always have been. It is the thing that got us here, not from that chamber, but from the first moment a human being looked at the world and decided to understand it rather than simply endure it. We are a species of engineers and storytellers and stubborn, infuriating optimists who find the broken things and stay up all night working on them. Because the problem is interesting, and the problem matters, and there is something deeply wrong with leaving a thing broken when you have the knowledge to fix it. Velsitha asked me on the last evening of the repair project why we had come back, why we had turned the freighter around, why we had handed over the solution to people who had voted us out. I had told him that we wanted to, that my grandfather had taught me something. What I did not say, what I did not need to say, because it was already evident in 11 days of work and 700 years of accumulated human experience, is that we had come back because walking away from a problem you can solve is not something we have ever learned how to do. It is not always comfortable, this quality. It is not always appreciated. There have been times, many times in my own life and in the long history of my species, when the work was done and the thanks did not come, or came only partially, or came in forms that did not quite match the effort. It does not matter, or rather, it matters in the way that things matter when you keep them in proportion. The work was real. The problem was real. The 12 minutes between a fault and a darkness that could have affected millions of lives was real, and we reduced that number to 0, and that 0 will hold for a very long time because the architecture behind it was built properly. That is enough. It has always been enough. Outside the viewport, the 3 stars of the trinary system turned in their ancient, patient argument. The station hummed around me, warm now, steady, alive with the particular life of a place that is working as it should. I opened my pad. I had 2 infrastructure proposals to finish. I started working.